I like Arcane and I like to sculpt things about the things I like. A couple of years ago I sculpted Jinx, and now it's finally time to flex my artistic skills once again by sculpting Jinx's sister, Vi. Now, throughout the whole series we see her with a bunch of different looks, and while sculpting her as she appeared in this scene would get a lot of attention, I ultimately decided that I wanted to go with this look since I feel it's her most iconic outfit. As always, I'm going to start by drawing a guide that's going to help me with the proportions and all that. Then with the help of these lines I made a two-part armature, and with some epoxy here and here I'll keep the armature in one piece. Then I'll cover the wires with some epoxy to give the clay something to hold on to, and once it cures I'll give it the pose that I want, which is going to be this one. Then I'll put it on a brick of Super Sculpey, and now comes the always relaxing step of just adding the clay without worrying too much about any detail. In this part, the only thing I had to worry about was the general anatomy. Of course, checking the proportions with the guide was extremely important. Fortunately for me, since she has baggy pants and a jacket, I don't have to worry too much about the finer anatomical details. Unfortunately, her baggy pants have a bunch of wrinkles, and those wrinkles are the next step. And since she has a bunch of bandages around her legs, I have to make these wrinkles with the space for those bandages in mind. She also has some sort of window on both sides of her pants, so I made those, and on these legs she has a pretty large patch, and on top of it just a little pouch. Then I added this little rectangle here, these lines in the middle, and made a couple of flat little rectangles and put them here. And for now I'm gonna leave her legs like this, since I think that adding all the other bullshit nonsense details is going to be easier once she's baked. Okay, now going up to the chest, I'm gonna start by adding Caitlin's favorite cupcakes, then her waist gets covered with whatever the fuck she has around it. This thing has some lines, so I made those, then some wrinkles get added here and there, and now we can move on to her neck. Oh, okay, that was easy. Let's make the head! This is always the most important part on this type of sculpture. Not necessarily the hardest, but my main job here is to make this lump of clay look like Vi's face. If her face looks perfect, but her body doesn't, then that's not a big deal. But if her face isn't good enough, then it doesn't matter how good the rest of the sculpture looks. That doesn't mean I didn't put any effort into sculpting her body, but you get the point. The face is really important. So with this one I really tried my best. But at the end of the day you'll be the ones to determine whether this looks like Vi or not. Let me know in the comments. But not now! The likeness won't be noticeable until I paint her and add her hair, which I'm not going to sculpt yet. The head will become too difficult to maneuver, and I was really happy with what I had sculpted so far, and I didn't want to accidentally ruin it while attaching it to the body. And speaking of that, okay, now for the jacket, after carefully considering many options, I decided that making a flat rectangle which I would put here to then make it go around her back and have it end at the other side, followed by another piece that I would put above, which would have two small flaps that would go over her shoulders to make them connect to the first piece, would be the easiest way to make her jacket. Of course, it is better to show it than to describe it, so... Then I made the sleeves by placing a couple of thin layers on both arms, and with that I started adding all the wrinkles and additional details of her jacket. Once I was done with the jacket, I decided to work on the hands until I realized that she has some big fat fucking gauntlets that would cover all of this. So yeah, sculpting the hands would be pretty pointless. As for the gauntlets, I figured that making them out of air-dry porcelain clay would be the best option. You know, making flat panels and all of that is always easier with this material, but I still ended up making the main shape of these gauntlets out of polymer clay. The only details I made were these lines, but all the other mechanical stuff would be added later. And after making the hood, she was ready to be baked. But here I faced a real conundrum. If you've watched the Jinx video, you'll remember that I beheaded her before I baked her. That's because it is always easier to paint a face while it is not attached to a body. It is just awkward to paint those details while you have an entire body, making the whole thing harder to handle and maneuver. With Jinx I didn't have a problem cutting off her head because she has this thing as part of her design, so I was able to use that line to make the cut. But Vi's neck doesn't have anything like that, so I had two options: make the cut somewhere around here and then erase the seam with epoxy and paint, or I could use this V shape for the cut. After carefully thinking about it for 5 seconds, I ended up going for the second option because I realized that painting this tattoo on the back of her neck would be easier with the neck also detached from the body, and after all of that, she was ready to be baked. Once she was out of the oven, I started to add all the remaining details of her costume. For most of these I used epoxy clay. This one doesn't need heat to cure. It comes in 2 parts and once you mix them it starts the curing process. It has a pretty generous time window before it really starts to harden, and because most of these details were pretty basic and easy to make, time wasn't a concern. And for the details that had more complicated shapes, I used air dry porcelain clay. This one, as the name might suggest, dries with air. It comes in a little bag and it also has a pretty generous time window before it dries. But this also depends on how big or small the thing that you're working on is. The bigger the piece, the longer it'll take to dry. As I said, this material is also pretty good if you want to make flat panels, and that's exactly what I need for the details on her gauntlets. For these panels I just had to flatten some clay on a cutting board and let it dry for a couple of hours. Then I used the guide to transfer the shape of each piece onto the clay. That way I could make sure each piece ended up with the same size on both gauntlets. Then I cut them out, and since the inner parts on some of these pieces were a bit lower than the outline, I adjusted them a little bit, and this is the result. Of course, these gauntlets have a lot more shit than just this thing. There's also this rectangle and these 2 pieces. There's this thing and this other thing. There's a couple of weird pieces here and some tubes on both sides. Then there's the panel that goes on the other side, and this thing and this other thing and this thing, and okay, let's glue together all this shit. This part has some additional details, so I made those with epoxy, and now we can move on to the fingers. My original plan for these was to sculpt them one by one, but then I realized that making them look the same was going to be a headache, and besides, these kinda looked like crap. So I tried another method. First I made these little guides for each part of each finger, then I transferred them to a previously flattened sheet of clay. This one was pretty thin. Then I cut them out, bent them like this, glued them together, filled this space with more clay, added these details, and look, that's a finger! A finger. Okay, cool. Then I made the other ones, and the thumbs, then I glued them next to each other, and finally glued them on the gauntlets. But hey, there's something missing here. Looking at this image, I noticed some tubes and mechanical looking stuff here, so I made this little worm, waited until it dried, cut it into a bunch of little pieces, glued them together, and gave them some extra bits to make them look less plain and boring, and because that's how they're supposed to be. For these circles I flattened more clay and used this thing to cut them out, then I glued each one in place, and that's it for this piece. This part here also has some circular looking stuff, so I used these caps for that. Then I added this and this and this and this and this, and okay, that's it. I'll do the assembly later, once everything's painted, so for now I'll leave them here while I sculpt her hair. For this I used epoxy clay, and I'll start with this side since it's the easiest one. Yep, that was easy. And this side, oh god, I had to put a lot of hair strands of different sizes, one by one. Sounds simple, but it wasn't. Trying to get the right shape and size of each one was quite difficult. Fortunately for me, all the art critics of the world have said that I am the absolute king of art, and as such I ended up doing a pretty good job with the hair. By the way, I made the thinner strands out of air dry porcelain clay. This clay is a bit more flexible when it dries, that's why. And that's it. Okay, let's paint her. I made the body first, so it deserved to be painted first. I started with a base tone for each part of her costume, so a bit of brown here and here, a yellowish, greyish light brown for her pants, a bit of white for her shirt, some blue for her boots and whatever the fuck this is, a bluish green for this patch, and a little bit of red for her jacket. Then I painted some of the smaller stuff like these stripes, the bandages, this pouch, her arms. I'm also trying to mimic as best as I can the art style of the show, and I figured that painting some of the tone variations caused by the areas that are supposed to be in the shadows, like this part here for example, would help with that. I also decided to paint some of the highlights, especially the ones on the metallic parts like this one. This is something similar to cel shading, but a bit more subtle. And so, little by little, this beautiful lady is starting to come to life. I won't paint this part here because I need to add the hood first, and for that I need to glue her head here, and that means it's time to paint it. The same principle applies here, based on first, then some shadows and highlights, but this time is way more difficult because I have to keep in mind the subtle tone variations of her skin, like for example there's a darker tone below her mouth and eyes. Some of those little things can be barely noticeable, but every single thing is extremely important. Then with the face completely painted, it was time to paint her hair. It wasn't that difficult, but it was fun. I enjoyed this part. Unfortunately, the tattoo on her neck wasn't fun to paint. It was annoying, and the tattoos on her arms were annoying to paint as well. But with the head completely painted, I glued it in place with the help of some epoxy and a bit of super glue. I also used epoxy to improve the look of this seam and to sculpt the hood. Then I painted it, and now it's time to paint the gauntlets. I used epoxy and super glue to attach the gauntlets, and that's... oh wait, I forgot the base, god damn it. Okay, let's do one quickly. Okay, that's it. I hope you liked it. Let me know what you think in the comments. I have a Patreon, so give me your money, I need it more than you do. This one was difficult. There's a lot of little bullshit details on this one. I honestly think Jinx was a bit easier. Yeah, Vi was something else. Here's a size comparison with Jinx. I'll be uploading more photos on my Instagram. I'll leave the link for that in the comments. Okay, that's it. Bye.